Hi, my name is Bruce Gay. I'm a senior program manager from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm here to speak to you today about design thinking for life sciences. So many of you may be thinking, what is design thinking? You've heard about this. Design thinking is a practical, user-centered methodology that embraces trial and error and the immediate feedback that teams can achieve through testing and validating of prototypes. This is actually a very useful problem-solving approach. And core to design thinking is having the users at the center, doing experimentation, doing a trial and error, and iterating on prototypes. So what do academics think about design thinking? Hassi and Laasko have done a lot of research, and this is what they've sort of gleaned from the literature, both in business and in academia. And that there are unique practices, cognitive approaches, and mindsets that are common to design thinking. Design thinking is human-centered. It is thinking by doing. It's about visualizing concepts, and I'll talk about this a little bit shortly. It's about using divergent and convergent approaches. And it relies on a multidisciplinary, collaborative work style. The cognitive approaches that are part of design thinking, it includes both abductive and reflective. It requires more of a holistic view and integrative thinking. And lastly, a mindset that is useful for design thinking is being able to be explorative and experimental, tolerant of ambiguity, future-oriented, and optimistic. As I noted earlier, being visual really allows you to be more precise in your communications. As I've talked to many people around the world about design thinking, there's a practice that I use that's called speed sketching. And this speed sketching is a method to have participants very quickly draw out some sketches for some common words. And the goal of this is to show those doing the sketching that very common words quite often might have different meanings from where you come from. And so this worksheet that I show here on the left is what I use with these groups during the workshops. And on the right are some of the examples. So with the word mouse, about 2/3 of the individuals will draw an animal for mouse. About 1/3 or even 1/4, depending on the scenario, I'll have individuals who draw a computer mouse or a computer peripheral that's a mouse. When you say the word computer, some people will draw it as a laptop, others as a desktop. And when I've run this workshop in the US and in Canada, quite often for coffee, we get the to-go cup that is shown here on the right-hand side. And then in other countries where they might have a greater tea culture or a culture that doesn't have too much of a to-go cup, the coffee mug on the left-hand side is what's drawn. And then lastly, when asked to draw the word home, individuals that live in colder climates will draw structures that have a chimney on them, while those in warmer climates, such as Jamaica, will have no structures at all. So the thing that I'm trying to point out here is that design thinking encourages visualization and making our thoughts reality, taking the concepts that are in our head and bringing them out into reality so that we can be more precise on what we're thinking about and interact with others in that respect. Now, there's many different design thinking models out there, but one of the most common is from the Stanford Design School. It's a 5-stage model. You'll see similar models to this, and they may have different naming conventions, but it's essentially these 5 steps. The first step is to empathize. And what this really means is that you're taking time and your team to research and understand your users. Often that means going to the place of where they live, where they work, or where they congregate, so that you can understand what their needs are and how they interact with the product or service that you're offering. After your team has finished that research and has collected data, then you come back and you have the define phase. And this is where you combine your research and start to synthesize it and look at some of the insights and start to derive some of the user needs. At this point too, your team is starting to fashion a problem statement around what you're trying to solve. In the ideate stage, this is the stage that most people will see in pictures on the internet, where there's a group of individuals working within a space with lots of post-it notes. And this is where you do brainstorming. In the ideate stage, this is where teams will generate a range of creative ideas and harness the collective understanding and vision and experiences of the team to come up with these ideas. And this is one of the best things about design thinking is after you've studied the consumers or the customers or the users of your products and services, then you come back and you start to define what problem you want to solve. And then you take time to brainstorm how are some of the ways that you can do this. And this is where having a more open-ended look at how to solve this problem is very important. And then from that, teams will start to build real tangible representations and prototypes that can then be used in testing. And then the last stage here is testing. And in fact, this is key, is rather than waiting to the end of a cycle, is to take things that are in a conceptual or prototype form and get them in front of your customers for reactions. In this respect, design thinking fits very well with some of the more modern and agile techniques that are being used. Now, I speak a lot about design thinking to project management audiences. And in project management, in my field, projects have a definite start and a finish. And so what we sort of do is there is a linear process that we go through. So there's a start, and then there's the implementation and execution of a project. And during that, as a manager, we're monitoring, controlling progress. And then there's a closing. And the next figure that I'm going to show you is actually, it gives a much better picture of how design looks in the process. And so in this respect, design thinking is much more of this squiggle that you see here, where up front there's some perhaps turning and bends and trial and error. It looks a lot more chaotic than what a very straightforward project or process would look like. But as you see, as you start to work through and do research, it does at some point start to converge into a clear prototype and a design. And toward the end, you end up with a single design there. Now, I also talk to people about how analysis differs from design. And so analysis is characterized by an attempt to solve a known problem. And through this, you start to break down the problem into smaller, more digestible chunks in order to gain a better understanding of it. And analysis relies on proof. Design, on the other hand, is characterized by an attempt to create a response to something that is a perceived problem. It's a bit forward thinking, it's a bit out there. And the purpose is it's a purposeful move from the current situation that we have to a more preferred situation. And design relies quite heavily on trial and error to move through it. And as you can see from the figure at the bottom left, analytical problem solving starts with what we already know and converges down to what we want to build. Whereas in design, we start with framing the problem space. We look at and research what we need to know. It's divergent because quite often you may be investigating and doing discovery across multiple paths until you get to a point where you understand the problem. And then the teams will start to converge back together into building and focusing on the solution. Now, design thinking also helps reduce overall development costs. What you're seeing here is a graphic that was first offered by Tom Gilb in his Principles of Software Engineering Management. And what he posits here is that it is much cheaper to solve for defects in your product or service earlier in the process than to wait until after it's been launched and it's out in the hands of your customers and users. So one of the goals of design thinking is to spend the time and iterate on the earlier concepts to make sure that your team is tackling the right problem. And at that point, making some adjustments, it's only 1 times the cost versus the 100 times the cost after something's been launched. And as I mentioned before, I speak a lot to project and program managers. And one of their first thoughts is, well, this is going to cost quite a bit of money for me to go and try to identify users and have my teams do testing with them and. But in fact, the research has shown from a study in the 1990s that even having just 5 users work through user testing, your team will be able to uncover about 85% of the usability defects in that process. And in my own experience at my hospital, in the testing that we do, is I can definitely concur with this. By the time I get to 5 or 6 users of the iteration that I'm on and their feedback, anyone beyond that, I'm not learning, and my team is not learning much more. We've had cases where we've gone out to have 12, 10, 11, 12 users, and it turns out they're not giving us any new feedback that we didn't know with just 5 or 6. Now, let me spend just a little bit of time going through a case study with you. As I mentioned, I work in a hospital. It's a 30 hospital system across Western Pennsylvania in the United States. And what I'm showing you here is our abdominal imaging chief of radiology. He's the fellow in white. And this is a radiology workstation, the 4 monitor computer setup that you see there in the table. And my program that I worked on was to re-architect and rework this clinical workstation for our doctors and the associated technologists that work with them. So what were the problems that were in place here? And so the radiology workstations was very much a image-centric and not a patient-centric flow. They had lots of data silos and had to log into multiple screens. And quite often, the radiologists that were doing their job, they weren't receiving upstream data, so they didn't always know everything about the patient that they needed to know. And so not only were there silos, but the systems weren't talking to each other. There was often too much information, but it wasn't intelligent information. And these systems, being that they were about 10 to 12 years old, had very poor user interfaces, and those included multiple pop-up boxes and complex menus. So what did my leadership do when we started this program 6, 7 years ago? Was that they had a thesis that by using design thinking and embedding designers into our product development teams, this would produce higher quality product, lower usability defects, and higher overall satisfaction from the radiologists and the other clinical staff in the hospital. And what we did was, over time, we hired up a cadre of designers who worked with our development teams. They conducted a lot of research to better understand the radiologists and the way they did their work. They mapped their experiences of doing work, and then they spent quite a bit of time looking at conceptual designs and prototypes. So these were, after they did the research, we did the synthesis and the definition phase, and we pulled the concepts and the designs and the prototypes out of the research that we had and made them real, and then had the doctors react to them, as you can see in this picture here. And also we had a space within our offices where we had some demonstration workstations that, as we built the software and upgraded the software, we would have doctors come in and do their work with those systems to test through it. And the results were that over time, we found that the close collaboration among the designers, the engineers, the clinical staff, and the radiologists, this helped us to do a much faster, rapid iteration on designs and prototypes. Additionally, we had co-design sessions between the technical, business, and design staff, which helped to uncover some of the constraints between legacy technology and the desired user needs. And over time, since we were collecting usability and satisfaction metrics, we found that the numbers that we were getting from our customers were going up. Now, as I come to a close here, there's a lot of material out there to learn about design thinking and a lot of resources for you. So IDEO was one of the earlier companies that made design thinking much more popular within the business field. But Frog Design, Stanford Design School, Luma Institute from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I'm from, they all have very good resources and a lot of materials that you can use. Google has its 5-day design sprint. IBM has its own flavor of design. The Interaction Design Institute has a lot of videos and information for you to use as well. So I want to thank you for your time. Again, my name is Bruce Gay. I look forward to connecting with you on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or other thoughts.